What's up, everyone? Brady Fugel here, coming at you nice and late with a review of Knocked Loose's new record, You Won't Go Before You're Supposed To, released a couple days now, May 10th. It's their first full-length record since 2019's A Different Shade of Blue, but I personally consider A Tear in the Fabric of Life, their EP from 2021, to be their true last body of music that they've released. And that EP really got me interested in these guys. Because as opposed to their two LPs that they had out at the time that were very, very hardcore based, very breakdown heavy, they released that EP that kind of incorporated more and more elements of actual metal and death metal, which ended up being a phenomenal EP. And right off the bat, the lead single to this album, Blinding Faith, had me very genuinely excited for this record. And honestly, the other two singles did a pretty good job of that as well. Blinding Faith structurally is just a very unpredictable song. And it maintained a lot of those death metal influences that they had on Tear in the Fabric of Life. So even as somebody who is definitely more of a metal fan than a hardcore fan, or a heavy hardcore fan, which is probably how I would classify these guys, I was excited at the prospect that they might have a bit more to offer than some of these hardcore bands that are pretty much all breakdowns, or I guess focus more on just the straight up brutality as opposed to having some actual musicianship, which is typically what I look for in a new metal release, or a new hardcore release for that matter. And that being what I look for, this kind of ended up being an interesting record for me. Because right off the bat, you have Thirst, which just takes your fucking head clean off right when it kicks in. It starts out as kind of just like a noise track for the first 20 seconds or so, and then it just fucking explodes in your face with some very fast-paced drums and these belting just screams from lead singer Brian Garris, who, despite the memes, is a pretty freaking good vocalist. Easily one of the most identifiable screams in the hardcore, metalcore, metal genre today. Although I do think a lot of the memes are really funny, I will admit that. I saw another reviewer here say that he sounded like angry SpongeBob, which is just hilariously accurate. But jokes aside, he really kills his performance on this record. The anger and the grit that he writes in his lyrics beautifully reflects on this record. And I could say the same for, honestly, their whole discography, but this record in particular, he really just lets all of it out. I've already singled out Thirst as a perfect example of that. Piece by Piece is another really good example. Overall, I'd say the first 4 tracks really start this album off well, because you get Piece by Piece and Suffocate the Song with Poppy, which honestly really surprised me, especially considering the god-awful, dance metal song that she put out with Bad Omens a few months ago. But her screams actually sound very good on here, and even her clean vocals add this kind of extra layer to this song. But that extra dimension really adds to the song and the album as a whole, which is also why the songs Take Me Home and Sit and Mourn are probably my 2 favorites on the record. They have these really cool ambient sections that are then contrasted by these very aggressive sections that really actually complement each other very well. They almost sound eerie. They're definitely not melodic, but it's just this extra layer of ambiance that gives this record a much needed breath of fresh air at times. Because here's the thing. If you are a genuine, hardcore, devoted fan of Knocked Loose, or of the heavy hardcore subgenre as a whole, you will love this record. If you're someone that kind of just casually listens to hardcore every now and then, this record might be a bit too much for you. And for me, I'm somewhere in kind of the middle of that. Because here's the thing, I don't think there's a single bad song on this record. But when you're listening to this whole record, song by song, multiple times, preparing for a review in my case, it becomes a definite chore to get through, because at times it is just so loud and in your face. It almost gives me a headache, honestly, when I listen to the entire album through and through. And I realize this might not be a thing that impacts the majority of listeners, especially considering that I feel like nobody really listens to albums all the way through now because of just how many singles are released before the record, and they can just add it to playlists, the songs they like. But as someone who genuinely enjoys listening to records as a whole piece, I think that's a genuine criticism to make. even with the ambient sections and those breaks that I mentioned, because they only last for so long and then they just get launched back into the chaos. But again, not that that's a bad thing. I do genuinely enjoy pretty much every song on here. Lead single Blinding Faith has been on my repeat playlist for the last few months. The Calm That Keeps You Awake is another big highlight for me. It opens with that really cool, almost tribal sounding drum beat and those sound effects in the background. I thought that was a really nice extra layer to this album. It's also one of the more riffier songs on here, which, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not really a fan of the constant use of breakdowns. And this album is very, very breakdown heavy, which as a guitar player is another thing that kind of makes it a chore to get through when you're listening to it as a whole body of work. Because Tear in the Fabric of Life was so good to me because it had such a good balance between breakdowns and actual riffs, and at times even the breakdowns themselves were a lot more riff focused. Contorted in the Fail is a really great example off of that EP where the breakdowns are a lot more riff focused as opposed to just boom, 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 boom. That first breakdown in that song being a perfect example of that. God Knows is another really good example that they got a breakdown about a minute or so into the song where it's just irresistibly catchy. And again, very riff focused. And the song Permanent is a very good example of that as well. Honestly, that entire song. So going from that to this where they really beat you to death on these breakdowns was a bit disappointing for me. And it's not just the breakdowns themselves, but it's actually how they sound and how they're produced. Because the guitar tone on this album is so muddy. These guitars sound way less crisp than they did on Tear in the Fabric of Life, to the point where sometimes you can't even tell what's being played. It also doesn't help with the very aggressive nature of this music in general, plus the very low guitar tuning. But listen to this album and then listen to Tear in the Fabric of Life, and specifically those riffs that I just mentioned. You'll see the difference. The guitars on that record sounded so pristine and just sharp and in your face. The guitars on this record just kind of loom over you, and they're more just background noise, which makes the breakdowns sound pretty cool. But aside from that, it's very hard to even hear what the guitars are doing, especially with Brian Garris's very prominent and loud vocals over them. It's not a huge deal breaker for the record for me, but it is something that kind of bothered me again. That being said, I think the rest of the band sounds great. The drums really pop, the bass is very prominent. And again, Brian Garris delivers a very good vocal performance. But a quick side note here on the vocals, and this doesn't even just apply to this record, it applies to all of Knocked Loose's records so far. Lead guitarist Isaac Hale does some awesome fucking growls. They're present on all of Knocked Loose's albums, but he sounds so fucking good. Why do they not use his growls more? I understand obviously Brian is the lead vocalist, but when you have a backing vocalist that sounds that good, I feel like it would be a no-brainer to kind of have, at least on a song or two per record, more of a two-vocalist dynamic. There's a few instances on this record where he's audible and these growls are heard and they sound fucking awesome. Blinding Faith being probably my favorite instance of that, in that those first few lines in that first verse. I just feel like it's kind of a missed opportunity. And if they were to, hypothetically, make a more metal-tinged record, I definitely think they should use him as kind of, I don't want to say a co-lead vocalist, but at least give him some more prominence. So overall, I would say this is a pretty good record. As I mentioned earlier, I like all the songs. The only one I'm a little lukewarm on is Slaughterhouse 2 with Chris Motionless. And I actually mentioned this in a video I uploaded the other day, my Bullet for My Valentine discography ranking, but I'm not usually a fan of when bands do part twos of songs. It often to me feels kind of like a money grab, especially considering how successful the first Slaughterhouse track was. So maybe it's just the fact that it doesn't feel genuine to me, but that's really the only one that I kind of skip sometimes. And even though my criticism does still stand that the album is a bit difficult to get through when you listen to it as a full body, this record is good. And for that reason, I'm going to give it a flat 20 out of 30. I definitely think it's a slight step down from Tear in the Fabric of Life, and I hope they do decide to push those metal influences a little bit again. But if you're a fan of these guys, and if you're a fan of hardcore, modern hardcore, you will definitely like this album. So that about does it. I would love to hear what you guys think of this album, so please comment below. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.